In the interest of time, I always hate to interrupt such great conversation, and looks like everyone is getting enough to eat. So we've had a nice spread out there, but I see a lot of people I don't think I've met before. I want to welcome all of you who are coming to these programs and to SMU maybe for the first time, and we want to encourage you to come back. I know my friend Reek brought a delegation from Texas Instruments. We have many Delaware area companies that are represented here today, a lot of multinational corporations. I should introduce myself. I'm Jim Hollyfield, the director of the Tower Center and the acting director of the Texas-Mexico Center. We have a big program coming next week here on Mexico for those of you on the legal and constitutional reforms in Mexico. I think there's a flyer, Astrid, we've been distributing flyers, QR codes, show all the many things that are happening here on campus. The Tower Center is the Center for Public and International Affairs, not all SMU, but for Dallas-Fort Worth. So we're glad to see so many of you here today. I just want to at least recognize a couple of special guests before I turn it over to my colleague, Takeuchi Sensei. I know that we have full of diplomats here with us today, including our great friend, the Consul General of Canada, Susan Clark. Let's give her a hand. Something happened in Canada yesterday. I'm not sure exactly what, but she also has her colleague Charlie with her, who is in charge of bilateral investments, Canada and the U.S. And I think most of you know that there's a very big Canadian interest here in North Texas. I also see Sam, who is the Honorary Consul General of Japan, who's with us today. Give him a hand. So I don't know if I violated protocol, if I've forgotten any other prominent diplomats who are here. I apologize, but we're going to plunge into a really non-controversial topic. Nobody in here has been thinking about trade, right, in the past. I've been teaching that for 40 years, and always a very boring topic to students. How do you get them interested and exciting about trade? Probably done lectures about tariffs in my life. So who would have thought that we would be here where we are today in terms of U.S. policy? But I think I will stop there. I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Dr. Sensei, who is the director of our program on Sun and Star program on Japan and East Asia. I guess the sun is the rising sun of Japan. The star is the lone star of the state of Texas. So please join me in welcoming Takeuchi Sensei.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. I'm Hiroki Takeuchi, Director of Sun Star Program on Japan and East Asia. As long as I know, Sun Star Program on Japan and East Asia is the only East Asia program that has Japan before East Asia, which actually Consul General of Japan in Houston always likes. We are Sun and Star program. Sometimes our guest says Sun Stars program, but it's not, it's wrong because star has to be singular because we are in Texas. And then also, for those who are familiar with Japan, we are not related to Sunstar. That is a famous toothpaste company in Japan. So we are not sponsored. We are not sponsored by Sunstar. Today, this is the last event, public event of the SMU Tower Center. So I'd like to acknowledge our staff members, without whom none of our events would have been possible. So we all know Astrid over there. Thank you very much. And also we have Ray here, our financial manager of the Tower Center. Thank you for Also, my colleague, of course, we all know Jim Holyfield. At the same time, my colleague of the political science department, Avshalom Schwartz. Also, I'd like to acknowledge our visiting director of Japanese language program, Leonard. Is he there? Oh, yeah, Leonard. It's important because later I talk a little bit more about it, but Dr. Beeman is an SMU graduate and who studied Japanese. So, thank you, Leonard, for directing Japanese language program. And then also, briefly, I will mention, so before introducing Dr. Beeman more formally, again, Dr. Beeman is a SMU graduate, Dallas native. You were born in the Oak Cliff Hospital, Methodist Hospital, and then grew up in Irving, and to MacArthur High School. So, and then I came to SMU, and he studied psychology and then also Asian studies and business. And we have Lisa Annette, who created SMU's Asian Studies program. And also, he went to Kansai Gakuin University for a semester when he was a SMU student as an exchange student. We have a very big program, SMU in Japan program at the Kansai Gakuin University, KGU. Now, every summer, when he was a student, we had a quite big semester program. And then still, like the KGU students come to SMU. So we have also a scholarship for SMU in Japan program at KGU. And then I'd like to acknowledge two people. One is Anna McFarland, who spent time in KGU for a long time and for a few times, and then also his father, Dr. Neil McFarland, was a provost and a professor at SMU, and he created the foundation of our ties with KGU. So, Anna, thank you. Also, Mr. Hideto Nishitani, who founded the McFarland Memorial Scholarship a few years ago, and then he actually created the scholarship for those who are going to Japan to KGU to study at our program. Mr. Nishitani, thank you very much. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Beeman, who was, again, graduated from SMU, and then he went to Master of Public Policy program to Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And then he went to Oxford University to get the PhD of politics at Oxford St. Anthony's College. His dissertation's topic was Japanese industrial policy. And then after that, many PhDs of political science, he went to the practitioner field, public service. And the first assignment was at the Department of Commerce. And then later he turned to a US Trade Representative Office. And he was assistant USTR in charge of Japan, Korea, and APEC countries under three very different administrations, Obama, Trump, and Biden, with four very different US representatives, Ron Kirk, Michael Froman, Robert Lighthizer, and Catherine Tai. And he was at the side of creating the TPP during the Obama administration, and then he was in the negotiation of post-American withdrawal from TPP, trade negotiation under Trump and Biden. So he had a very interesting career. A lot of the things he talks about. Every time I meet him, I learn a lot from him. So now he wrote the book. titled Walking Out. And when I started reading this book, which was published last year, I told my wife that I shouldn't read this book at night because I felt like this was a kind of horror book. And I told Dr. Beeman that the argument is disturbingly convincing. And so I felt like I actually was reading the convincing argument by the prosecutor for the murder case. So that's actually my feeling, but this is a great book. And you're a psychology major when I was at the SMU. Well, please join me for welcoming Dr. Beeman.
Thanks everyone for coming and for the lovely introduction. It's wonderful to see all of you. Actually, just to complete your metaphor, I just recently heard someone in Washington what's going on today on trade. Particularly, I think this commentator was talking about the U.S.-China trade war going on right now as a murder-suicide. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I do feel a little bit like prophet of doom, and this is actually the first presentation about my book, as Professor Takeuchi mentioned. I've published actually October of last year, but I wouldn't change a word except for about 2 typos I found over time, because I think it really sets up what I hope will be helpful for you to understand and how we got here, what is going on and why it's happening. Because I think without that understanding, we're all going to be floundering to figure out how, or if you're a fan of what's going on, well, welcome to your personal Disneyland. If you're not a fan of what's going on, I think it's important to understand how we got here in order to understand how to think out and talk about trying to see if there's a way to get out of it. But let's pretend for a moment that what has happened the last month and a half hasn't yet, and I will come to that, and I have had to update my presentation to help kind of move into the current day, the current moment, if you will. I need to check my news feed just to make sure it hasn't changed. Let's see. Okay, seems okay so far. I wrote this book because, as Professor Takeuchi mentioned, I was a trade negotiator for 16 years. Actually, everything Hiroki mentioned is correct, but actually I started at USTR in 2004 under the Bush administration, so I even go further back in terms of being a trade official negotiator. And throughout the whole time, I worked on Japan, and then later, as he mentioned, I added Korea and added APEC to my portfolio, so I was worked on those as well. But when I wrote the book, I left during the middle of the Biden administration, literally 2 years into the Biden administration, and I just had this urge, first of all, to leave Washington, and I literally, this is the true story. I officially retired from the federal government on like January 5th or 6th, I forgot, and literally the next morning at 6:30 in the morning, I got in my car and I drove as far away from Washington as I thought I could. Literally going to Stanford is where I had a visiting fellowship to be able to be there for off and on for 2 years to write this book and to reflect on what was going on, because at the time when I left, so many people thought of the US trade policy as being dictated by this dynamic of US and China, great power competition, and everything that was going on was a reaction to China and to the challenge of China. And those of us at USTR who were working on this knew that something much more fundamentally deep was going on, and it wasn't just China. I think now we've learned it's not just China. I think we can look around and understand that. But when I started to write the book, I really wanted to send this message. So that's the inspiration. And the title is the one thing I knew before I left Washington to go write. The rest of it was just a lot of grueling work, but I'm happy to hear it. At least it's if it's on the thriller or horror shelf, maybe it's a better sell. But let me walk a little bit backward into history because no one talks about this. And I was talking to Professor Hollyfield last evening, and we just have to remind ourselves where we came from and how we got to this point, because You know, it's true that the president basically continues to say that all decisions made on trade over the last 80, 90 years were just by a bunch of ignorant, stupid people. But, you know, that's literally what he says. You know, but the US led that system. It reflected US values, it reflected US principles, it reflected US vision. Of course, other countries had to, you know, to work into it and buy into it. And US never got everything that it wanted out of the system, and it was not perfect. It was absolutely not a perfect system. But already you hear me speaking about this system in the past tense. I think that's where we are. But let's review and go back a little bit, see how we got here. We all know that the international trading system began with Franklin Roosevelt and his vision for this system, but it really grew out of the harm and the difficulties of the Great Depression. So here is President Roosevelt on the campaign trail. This is after Smoot-Hawley tariffs. So tariffs were really kind of at the levels we're talking about today. And he's campaigning on the stump. And so he's a politician, so he's not going to say tariffs, we're going to get rid of them all. He's not at all that. But look what he does say. We must consent to the reduction to some extent of some of our duties in order to secure a lowering of foreign tariff walls. And this was to help the US recover economically out of the Great Depression. And the tariffs were seen as really contributing to the deepening of that depression. So that's sort of where he started, at least as president, or as a candidate for president. Where he ended up, and actually this is even just on the cusp of the US entering World War II, so this is August 1941, he sat down with Churchill. You know, the UK was already at war, and they were trying to figure out what the world would look like after the Allies won the war and what kind of world to consider. This is the Atlantic Charter, which is a UK-US document. And he spoke about an endeavor to further the enjoyment by all states, great or small, of access on equal terms, and I'll come back to that, the on equal terms, to the trade and the raw materials of the world which are needed for their economic prosperity. So here's this vision. This is bigger than just recovering from the Great Depression. This is a vision of a whole new world order, basically, that is in trade. This was the piece that was included in that charter even before the United States entered the war. Well, so I won't belabor much what happened. A lot of things happening, but this was the last president to really honor that commitment to the international trading system before we got to where we are now. And of course, where we are now is that the United States really is walking out, and I'll come to what this really means. But when I talk about walking out, I'm going to talk about the US walking out on its own vision for this system, on its own rules, its own values, its own efforts, its own interests in many ways that people fought for years to maintain and defend and fix and change as best as possible. So this is where we are today. What do I mean by walking out? Well, I'm a trade negotiator, so yes, I've walked out on a couple of negotiations before. It has a couple of reasons for doing this. One can be a protest, right? Your counterpart has said something that's outrageous and they set some conditions you can't agree to. So you're just going to leave the room and say, we're done here. I can't really have anything more to say about you know, I don't have anything more to talk about, basically. Oftentimes, though, walking out, of course, is a tactic in a negotiation, right? And it can be very, you know, it can be a physical act of walking out, like I'm going to walk out because I think I have more leverage than you, and so you have to come to me and you're going to have to kind of agree to the terms that I want before I can sit back and talk again. Or it can be very subtle. You can just kind of not answer emails. You can just like not decide to meet. There's the informal way of walking out as well. And so this is really kind of what the US was doing. If you just pretend the last couple months haven't happened and we're just kind of going back a little bit into history, this is really what there's a lot of complaints about the system and a lot of disengagement from the trading system the US supported for many years. But it hadn't really, for the most part, hadn't bolted for the exit and just said, we're done here and shut the door. That's kind of where we are now, basically. So that's what I meant in the book when I defined walking out. So if you don't believe me, you can listen to some of our leaders and their own words of their last 8 years. I think you'll recognize these words, which are renegotiate, withdraw, terminate, are some of the words used by a certain president who was in his first term. But the Biden administration, this is not President Biden's, the administration spoke also about the trading system being part of the problem or the need to write a new story on trade. These are also walking out words, right? Something about the system is broken. We're not gonna really honor it. We need to completely overhaul it, something else. So my point here is there's a consistent direction. This is started primarily in the Trump administration, the first administration, but it continued in the Biden administration. And now, of course, we're just getting this whole, this whole, Act 3 on steroids, basically, I think is where we are now. So the title of the book is a little quaint now because I knew we were headed in this direction. And I knew that if President Trump came back for a second term, when I did these talks last fall, I talked about how it was going to feel like 18 trucks headed down the highway in that same direction if President Trump were reelected. Well, I think that's probably what it feels like. And many people feel like they're literally in the middle of this highway being run over right now. So I think it's safe to say walked out. This is where I'm updating the presentation is a more accurate analysis and really a way basically as well. So let's just put it out there and be frank. The next set of slides is not to make you a trade expert. And I'm going to go through some things you've heard of, some things you haven't heard of. But the whole goal of this next slide next 2 or 3 slides is to help present a picture of just how fundamentally things have changed over just such a short period of time. And this is why I wanted to write about it in my book, how the US kind of built a system, added to the system, and layered onto the system a series of rules and values and principles and obligations and commitments and the rest. And then how it all just started evaporating basically before our eyes and before my eyes as a trade official as well. So again, I apologize in advance for what's going to look like a complicated picture, but just get the tone and the tenor of it, and I think it'll work and be helpful. So in what has America walked out, right? So this is a snapshot of where we were in 2015. This is when President Obama was still in office. The US was still very committed to the international trading system, the core of the WTO rules and principles and obligations. Those are the triumvirate kind of 3 pieces of the WTO and the international trading rules. First, the principle of non-discrimination. This is Roosevelt's equal access. This is what he meant by equal access. And it was reflected in the international trading rules. So it's equal treatment for trading partners. So if I charge you this tariff, I have to charge everyone else the same tariff, and no one gets kind of a better tariff than others get, basically. And you also have to provide equal treatment between domestic goods and imported goods, basically. So if there's a certain requirement for a domestic good, there's going to be the same requirement for the import. Basically, there's no discrimination between imports and domestically produced goods. The WTO also had a means for settling disputes, right? A dispute settlement body to amicably resolve disputes instead of take it out through tariff wars and tit-for-tat retaliation. And the WTO was still struggling at this point, but trying to liberalize trade in one way, shape, or form. It ran into a lot of problems when China and other countries didn't want to liberalize, but it still had an agenda, a negotiating agenda to liberalize trade. So it was headed in this direction. So that's a really typical picture for US trade policy over decades. The WTO also had a series of negotiations on making trade fair, their trade rules, basically. So this was going on at that time as well. What else was going on? The US had a very proactive bilateral or regional free trade agreement negotiating agenda. So this included TPP in the Asia Pacific. The US was also negotiating a mega free trade agreement with the EU at this point. The US also maintained a commitment to developing countries and to helping them through trade. So it provided tariff preferences for poor developing and some medium-sized developing countries. There were 2 programs that did that. One focused specifically on Africa, one focused on the entire world of the universe of developing countries, about 130 countries in all. And I won't go through the specifics of the program, but just understand that there was a way, US was committed to this, as many other countries are committed to this kind of helping developing countries do better through trade, basically. So that's 2015. So what changed? And this is such a typical picture of several decades of US trade policy, basically in one way or another. So what changed in 2017? Well, the US started discriminating, and that's, of course, started in the Trump administration, the first administration, discriminating among trading partners, but the Biden administration did it too, to be fair. And also discriminating between domestic and foreign goods became kind of a new thing, and this was done with subsidies for electric vehicles. There was other discrimination that came in. So the US kind of became more comfortable with discrimination in this process. During the first Trump administration, the US conveniently broke the WTO dispute settlement system. So basically it kind of left the dispute settlement, the amicably resolving disputes, really in the hands of the United States to decide what was best for the United States and who was going to, it's kind of a self-judging system now, basically, as far as US policy goes. The US stopped trade liberalizing negotiations with the world. So I'm just going to take that off the list. So that's gone now. And the Biden administration certainly wasn't going to touch it. The US did continue to negotiate of some rules in the WTO. They added, worked on digital trade rules with the world and with a subset of countries. So making trade fair continued in one way or another. The Biden administration then was uncomfortable with some of that, so they took it off. But there was still something going on there, and the US was actively involved. We see the bilateral free trade agreement agenda, traditional one, was gone, taken away by the Trump administration, although they focused on fixing the past. They focused on renegotiating old agreements. So we have, the now renegotiated NAFTA, we have the US-Korea agreement, and Japan, in the context of having walked out of TPP, getting some of that access back. So they focused on fixing the past, not on kind of advancing the future into the future. They did do a little bit of that. They started negotiations, the first Trump administration, with the UK and with Kenya on a kind of a new kind of free trade agreement with new style free trade agreement, basically. So there was some activity there. They were kind of moving and, so some of this agenda was still on the table. The Biden administration came in, and didn't want any part of that, liberalizing trade. And so they kind of framework agreements. And again, I know it's getting long and confusing, but you see how much this is changing because so many of the things I showed you before were really unchanging. It's just the subtitles that were changing. Now you get titles changing because they're just going in whole different directions. At the same time, the US Congress failed to reapprove developing country preferences for developing countries. And so I just took one of them off. The other one expires this year. That's going to disappear shortly. So we're no longer really committed to that anymore. So where we are today. So I had to update a little bit and just give you a sense of really, just in the last 3 months, basically, we're just discriminating against everybody, right? Just basically all trading partners and a unilateral resetting of trade terms with the world. Dispute resolution, well, self-judging, sure. I think is a better term at this point is we're really not going to be talking about dispute resolution with anyone. The US basically stopped being, I think is going to stop being involved in rules negotiations in the WTO. The idea of kind of these free trade agreements or restyled free trade agreements is gone. The free trade agreements we already have are basically meaningless now as long as the US is not actually honoring free trade and they're just going to raise tariffs on our free trade agreement partners. And as I mentioned, I think developing country preferences is just, it's over. You're not going to see this. You have to pass, even if it passes the Congress, which I think is likely, it doesn't feel absolutely positive. So I'm just going to take that off the list as well. And this is what is left of our trade policy over 8 years, just 8 years. This is where we are and how much things have changed over that period of time. So, we're all trade people now, right? Because the news is forcing us to be trade people. But I wanted to make that point because the amount of change is just fundamentally shocking. If you just go back a few years, basically. So why is this happening, right? I kind of alluded to this earlier, that the whole issue was China, right? And yeah, China is a huge problem, and I have a lot of things I can say about trade with China and why it's a problem. But I also argue, previewed, it's not just China. So a number of the other reasons that the administration and the Biden administration used to justify going backward on our trade obligations, to go backward on our trade commitments, to walk out on our trade commitments, included things like needing to preserve economic security or resilience, to protect the environment, to deal with that, just to deal with kind of regulatory freedom, freedom to regulate as U.S. regulators want to regulate and not be held to obligations, globalization and the concerns related to that. Big tech, actually rules about big tech. You can't so if you're helping big tech, you shouldn't be rules, basically, even if you're helping small business at the same time. Labor union rights is another one. There's a big disagreement over how far that should be taken and how it should be reflected in trade agreements. Sovereignty is another. So this looks like a pretty shot list, right? These are all the different justifications that either the Biden administration or the Trump administration or both used to walk out on U.S. trade, on the past of U.S. trade commitments. But there is a pattern, and the pattern is defined by please show up. Make sure it says yes. By this line. So let's look at the top part. Basically, the top part are all issues that involve foreign trading partners in one way or in foreign trade outside the U.S. borders, basically. So it's China, or it's too much dependence on imports, or it's too much of this or too little of that. And it all has to do with the foreign dimension of trade, which is trade, right? So what is going on the bottom? Actually, a series of issues that are very domestic, actually, in their focus. No one in the US can agree on the environment anymore, or at least the two sides, I shouldn't say no one. The environment, or big tech, whether to regulate it or to let it go. Labor union rights, how much, right to work states versus, labor union right states. Policy space, how to regulate the economy and whose consumer interest and safety and all those kinds of really important things. A lot of disagreements with that. So you get this bifurcation, and the bifurcation is, the top part is where the Trump and the Biden administrations basically agree. As I mentioned yesterday, this is why this is where Bernie Sanders sounds like Donald Trump on trade. It's a disaster, right? That's the top part. This is where these sides agree, basically. On the bottom part, enormous disagreement, right? So in the US, in the domestic space, the progressive left and the new right are fighting over the status quo on these issues, right? And so these become a proxy battle in the world of international trade, because when you write trade rules, I talked about how the US put itself, it's reflected its laws, its regulations, its values, its vision into the trading system. But now we can't agree on those rules that we pushed onto the world, basically, because we're fighting over them at home. So you get the top is kind of alignment and agreement between the progressive left and the new right. And the bottom, you get enormous disagreement, right? So this is trade policy, and this is where we got to in the United States and why things started to come apart, basically. Well, the actual reason things started to come apart, really, it was because of this polarization that's going on in the United States, which, let's start with this statement. I guess you may or may not agree with this phrase, America is exceptional, but I think we can all agree with the rest of the sentence, which is that America is exceptional in the nature of its political divide. This is where we are, and the US isn't the only country, and particularly in recent years, South Korea and others have really pretty much gone off the chart on this issue as well. But this political divide has been going on for, of course it's been going on for decades, but really going on in terms of the polling, in terms of one side, hating the other side, or however you want to define that, kind of tribalization of politics in this way, really since the financial crisis of around 2008, 2009, and things really started pushing and rolling during that period of time. And the polls just show the US really off the charts when it comes to how this has divided the US. So what do you get when you have a divided political system? It's a kind of a revolution of the political system, and you have the left and the right, the far left, the progressive left, and the new right, the far right, whatever you want to call it, are battling, and they are occupying the policy decisions now in Washington and in the White House, basically. So if you thought it was China, no, it's here. China's a problem, but it's here. So let me describe what this means just briefly in terms of polarization, how this has changed the international trading system and the US commitment to it. Polarization has led to a focus on zero-sum beliefs, right? This is really, really important to understand. What does that mean exactly? Well, zero-sum is the sense that if anyone else is gaining, it's coming at your expense. So it could be other countries gaining is coming at your expense, or it could be the Democratic Party's gains or at the Republican Party's expense. However you want to define that. It's on the foreign and the domestic side, basically. So what this does is help feed populism, because what is populism? It is the sense that there's an elite group and a corrupt group, basically, and they're arguing over what the pure and the corrupt, basically, and who's right and who's wrong. And if you're on the corrupt side, then you're not on our side. This also feeds nationalism, because a kind of a softer form of nationalism, at least, because nationalism focuses on the desire, one of the things is focused on the desire to reassert sovereignty. So reasserting sovereignty, I'll come to that in a second, in the international trade context means walking out, basically, right? So that's polarization. So the rules-based trading system is the contrast here. This is the Roosevelt vision. This is the, countless US presidents and administrations and Congress's commitments. Basically are in positive sum assumptions. The idea that a rising tide lifts all boats is very fundamental to the thinking of the system. It provides stability because there's predictability. There are rules that are being obeyed, or at least generally obeyed. The extent to which there's a division between camps, it's really between the developing world and the developed world. And this is kind of the big argument that goes on in trade. And the degree to have flexibility for developing countries. The goal is to facilitate peace. This is very much in Roosevelt's vision, right, for the trading system and many others. And how do you get facilitating peace and stability? You negotiate commitments, right? So what is negotiating commitments? I mean, you can argue you're giving up your sovereignty. Some people do believe you're giving up your sovereignty by negotiating these global commitments. These were US commitments and US rules, basically, for the most part. So I think there's a counter argument there, but you see the split and how this pulls and tugs at the principles of the trading system and how now we're off in this other thing, basically. So with that, let me turn to, let's see. Yes, so I'm just gonna kind of flip through this. I'm just gonna read through this next one pretty quick, just to really kind of try and distill the key points. So in the foreign dimension, us versus the international side of trade, there are kind of two thems, basically. It's foreign countries, and this includes allies as well as adversaries, although adversaries more. It also often includes multinationals when they're acting what I call as agents of global trade. So in other words, multinationals that are producing here, fine, great, produce here, but multinationals are producing abroad and exporting back to the United States, nope. You are them now, basically. And both the Trump and the Biden administration were very much in line with the them part there, essentially. So just to read through this quickly, let's see. Gains from trade are zero sum, focus on results instead of principles, focus on the harm from trade instead of the opportunity from trade. There's maybe a new center where you have this alignment of these two extremes on the outside. They're kind of meeting here. And where do they meet? They meet in the idea and the goal of walling off America in one way, shape, or form, basically. Going back and pulling back, erecting barriers, discriminating, however necessary to achieve that, and walking out to do it. The domestic side, you have this intense rivalry between the new right and the progressive left. And they are fighting over trade rules because they're fighting over the status quo in the United States. Neither side wants to live under the other side's rules, so they keep going back and forth and with rules and objectives. There are people who are trying to muck things up by creating controversies along the way. And so what do you get? after all this, you get this conflict. And so what you see now is flip-flopping. So they're consistent on the walking out and the walling off. They're inconsistent when it comes to a vision for what should be in there instead, because they're fighting over that vision in the United States. And that vision is being reflected into the trading system and being the consensus that used to exist, that used to support the rules-based trading system in the United States, different administrations, different Congresses, and the rest basically can't survive. It's quicksand now. Being in the middle is quicksand. It was never perfect. That's why I have two flags. You got Republicans and Democrats, and they all disagreed among themselves sometimes. But this is quicksand now, and it just couldn't survive. And the floor dropped out, basically, in the middle. So this is where we are. We're being pulled in these extremes. And some places are agreeing, and some places are disagreeing. So I think this is an important part of my presentation, which is I talked about the international trading system as though it's manna from heaven, as though it was this wonderful thing that everyone was peaceful and was, rising tide lifts all boats and the rest. So this is why I put this slide up, just to make the basic point that that's the international trading system as I described it, right? This is really what it's like, basically, to negotiate trade. Trade is very hard. There's a lot of difficult obligations, a lot of difficult commitments to try and achieve, a lot of difficult stakeholder concerns. And there's a ton of disagreement. And this is what trade officials do day in and day out all the time. It's really hard stuff. And everyone's trying to protect themselves, but also protect the system, right? Well, I just want to make the point because I don't want you to leave here thinking that going back to what it was is like a perfect world and we should all just go there, because it's broken and I think we're not going back. So I can talk a little bit about that later. But anyway, that's just to make that point. So let me just summarize with both a few points and then some implications. And this is where I had to also update the slides. Basically, America's new trade policy is often grounded in zero-sum assumptions. When you listen to people talk about trade now, you will hear it time and time again. Just listen for when they say, they give no credence to the idea that others could possibly gain from trade at the same time that the US gains from trade. They just don't say it. Because if they're winning, the US is losing. That is really very much the way it's viewed today. So there's that, fueled by exceptional political division, which I have described, and I think we all understand that. It rejects the status quo on trade. So this is where they're aligned, the two sides, where with discrimination is kind of where they agree. But they reject the status quo the United States. So this is where you get conflict and an inability to forge a new vision on trade instead. And then here is the last one is shadows of the 1920s and early 30s are back. These are my old slides. I'm going to update them just briefly here, if you just stick with it. So instead of fully grounded in zero-sum assumptions, not just often grounded, and the 20s and 30s are back in a big, huge way. So that's my update to the summary. Here's some implications. And there's so many now, but I'm just going to dig a little deep here. This is America's new normal for now. This is what I used to talk about. We're going in the same direction. As I used to say, was if Harris had won the election, we would still be going in this direction. It just wouldn't be this 18 Mack trucks going down the highway instead, basically, in many ways. So I'm going to change that to say it's supercharged. I think we can minimally say that, basically. Difficult to unwind new import restrictions. Once these protections and restrictions are put into place, very difficult to get out of them. Roosevelt took decades for the United States to kind of have these arguments and get out of it. Took a Great Depression and the need to climb out of an economic crisis to make the case that we need to pull back on this level of protection, that it was not helpful ultimately. So that's going forward. And I think it's also, this is what I've added, and repair what's broken, because a lot of things are broken now. There's very little consensus in the US on what this new vision is. This is where you get this flip-flopping between parties, other than walking out and throwing up more barriers to trade. Right? Let's see, right here. Continue to be a drag on the WTO international trading system. Well, isn't that cute? The US wasn't the only drag on the system. There were a lot of countries that were drag on the system. Everybody was dragging on the system. But the fact that the protagonist of that system was really starting to question its viability and question its future really, I think, kind of changed, it was a real sharp turn, bend in this downhill kind of a cycle, basically. So continue to be a drag seems a little soft to say. So let's just put it this way, because I think this is really where we are. It is this is a threat to the future of the system. It fundamentally is, and there's a lot of reasons I can explain why it is. But once you start pulling on all these strings and you pull on just enough of them, the whole thing starts to unwind, basically. I think we're at the beginning of that process if this continues the way it is. Let's see, where else are we? We also have, discrimination is a feature, not a bug. This is all on purpose. Tariffs, Trump 1.0, Biden, and discriminatory subsidies in Biden was where we started. Now we have the highest tariffs since the Great Depression in Trump 2.0. And then, let's see, I think this is maybe two more points. A thicket of new foreign relations issues, choices, and tensions. I used to talk about how all these things were going on as a trade official under the surface. If the US was basically violating its international trade rules, I used to always fight for US interests when other countries were violating these rules, when they put systems or programs into place that were very suspicious and seemed discriminatory, I'd be right in their face, basically. This was my job. I loved doing that, I'm sorry to say. This is what we did, and Canada was on the list sometimes. But this is what trade is, basically. But now this is just, and it was all that was going on under the surface. Now it's just, pretty obvious, basically. And so I have to change that, update that to damage. There's actual damage, enormous amount of damage going on to US credibility and to US foreign relations now. So we're heading that way. And then also other countries have a difficult time just kind of letting this slide, right? They have politics, they have people, and they have domestic interests. Well, why don't, if the US steel industry can do this, why can't the so-and-so steel industry do this? Why can't the German industry demand, protection, or the UK steel industry demand protection, or on and on and on. This just goes on and on. The list is very, very long, basically. So that is pretty much, that's just, a few, given all the severity of where we are. But I really did want to do a more traditional talk here, because I know everything that's going on. There's just so mind spinning, head spinning. That's also, I think, a reference to horror movies, basically. And at the same time, I think at least I'm really happy I wrote the book, because it was such a momentous change in US history and policy. And I thought it was, and in the book I go through, you get several pages on the China tariff war, you get several pages on negotiating with Korea, you get several pages on, so I kind of left a lot of that out, basically here to describe the overall pattern, because I think it's really important to understand that. It's important to understand how to talk about it. So the more that people are talking about trade in zero-sum terms, the more people buy into, well, all of Trump's tariffs are terrible, or going back to free trade is the only way to go. We're never going to get anywhere, because that just keeps pulling in the same zero-sum direction. There's no middle ground left to even have a discussion anymore. So in the book, I don't even use, I think only one time I use the word protectionism. As soon as you say free trade versus protectionism, the discussion's over, basically. So I don't do that. I barely used any numbers in the book. There's no charts and graphs. Because everybody has their numbers now. Like everyone, like if someone has their numbers and some of their numbers, and the discussion just ends, basically right there. So I think it's really important to focus on, listening to what the other side is saying, and acknowledging that, yeah, where there are a lot of problems, and maybe the United States can step up to solve these problems. But I'll just end with a line, because this is one of the lines I put in the book, which is one of the things that I think is as difficult as the system is to maintain, and as much has happened over many years. The one, I think, point that the US architects of the trading system as it started back in the 1980s could not have imagined, coming out of a world war, was the idea that the US would finally not be able to solve its own problems later on. And an inability to solve these problems really contributes to this lack of ability to something like this, because it takes a lot of time, a lot of adjustment, and there are real debates and real jobs and real concerns online here. But I'm afraid we're at a point where a lot of people are going to get hurt first before everyone begins to understand that we need to listen to each other. This is my proselytization. Thank you very much.
Okay, it's over, and then we do not have anything to talk about today. So I want to kick off kick off the discussion with this question. So let's accept the reality, and other kind of reality right now is global value chain that I'm working on right now. So firms are looking for the place that could produce with lowest cost, right? So in that case, these imposing tariffs will raise the production cost of the United States. So and then that's actually contradictory with the concern that many people have. That is we should protect people, you should protect workers, right? And then a standard explanation of why it happens that such a contradictory policy happens is I don't know about the reality of global value chains, which I disagree. Actually, I don't think. So I heard that argument from people who know about the reality of the international economy based on global value chains, and why do they still well, you don't want to use the protectionist policy, that word, but let's say the imposing tariffs, even if they know about, that will raise the production cost of the United States.
It's all very complicated, right? And I think that obviously the international system and the U.S. commitment to it was always based on the idea that there was always a way to go up and to skill up and to value up the chain, and the U.S. by virtue of universities like this, and by innovation, by capital markets that work as they are, the dollar and other reasons, would always be able to find that space, basically. I think it's fair to say, and it's not only fair to say, it's accurate to say that many people got left behind in that. Many people got ahead with this. And this is a pluralistic system, and so not everyone is going to be able to agree on the best course, because they're all going to have very different interests at the same time. So this is where the kind of the concept of the national interest really has to come in, and really where the bipartisan consensus will hold that together, that there's a greater thing here that we have to protect, basically. But in terms of value change, I mean, sure, you can have, you can raise tariffs and have protection, but one of the, obviously what is happening now is just a level of extreme that we haven't seen since the Great Depression, that is just, really going to twist so many people in a difficult direction. But, but some of the, if there some of these jobs are going to come back, or value chains are going to U.S. and be reshored in the U.S., automation is going to probably dominate a lot of that production, basically. So the question is, and of course, we're going to spend a lot more money as a nation on those investments, instead of kind of, the considered to stay ahead, basically, in the game. So there are going to be trade-offs. And there are people who want to make passionate arguments that a certain level of tariffs can be a good thing, and that's very mainstream, and well, certainly on the new right and the Trump right, that's even more than the progressive left are very always. You'll not hear Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren bash tariffs. You'll hear them bash Trump, but you won't hear them bash tariffs, basically, is my point. So this is kind of this idea that we should recreate, an effective tariff of some kind through industrial policy and the rest. The U.S., was not really good at this, to be honest with you. And these are decisions that have to be made in real time and have to be changed over time. So you're looking at a system, if you're going to do something like that, where you have to change tariffs consistent with on business conditions, price of oil has gone up, so to maintain the industry's competitiveness, you're going to have to change the tariff next year. These are very calculated, difficult decisions, which I think as a country we're not going to be very good at doing. So I think to your final point on global value chains, I think there is a legitimate exercise to be looked at as to the degree to which the United States should be thinking about how to anchor certain industries that are here and obviously promote new industries that should be here, and to think about bringing some production. So I do think there is a value in that, but I think this exercise, we're going to find the tariffs were a pretty bad way of doing it. And ineffective. I mean, effective to some, but ineffective across the board. Yep.
Professor Harfield?
Yes, actually in the book, I spent a whole chapter on it because this point coming out of the social crisis. The Democratic Party and President Obama was very skittish the first year about doing anything on trade, given the difficult politics and trade, but then kind of was overcome by this vision of doing a TPP and creating this rules-based system. And, it had a China outlook on it, but it also very much had other justifications as well. And one of them, which is missed consistently, is the idea. I mean, President Trump talks about reciprocal tariffs, and if they have this tariff, we should have this tariff. Well, free trade agreement is exactly that. Basically, a free trade agreement is zero for that is reciprocal trade at its most fundamental definition. So what he's looking for are reciprocal outcomes, not reciprocal trade, basically, or trade reciprocal balance, essentially. But TPP really is the first example of where the politics just overtook, that I just described, overtook. So you had this dynamic where the left and the right in particular were against free trade generally, against more free trade, against doing more of these FTAs, very critical for decades. Unions were very part of this and competing for those votes, and people who felt very affected by these agreements. At the same time, that's really not actually what the debate was about. The debate was really over the rules and disagreements that I described that were proxy battles that are going on in the United States. So be it investment rules, be it intellectual property protection rules, be it, and it was really, they were disagreeing over the rules of trade that were in US law and in US practice that they were now disagreeing with and didn't want enshrined in mega agreement for all eternity, basically, because they wanted to change them in the US. So they didn't want those agreed internationally because they didn't want them in the US anymore, basically. So that was really a lot of the debate really focused on that piece of it. And it just sat, all political momentum, basically, that traditionally has gone along with approving a free trade agreement. They're always hard. Very few Congress people and senators like to take trade votes because they can be controversial. But that is really where this all came off. And so I spend a whole chapter explaining that story in detail. It's us.
Yes.
Replace the income tax. Can you debunk this idea?
Since they're recording, do you want to repeat the question? Maybe it's better to phrase it yourself.
The latest thing I heard on television, Trump mentioned that the income tax will no longer take place or be replaced by new tariffs. The tariffs are going to save the U.S.
Right.
And make us rich.
Mm-hmm. I was just telling Professor Takeuchi that I mentioned I'm from Dallas originally. My mother is still here, and I was at her home after I arrived. I was looking through some of the old books that she had from her parents, and this is a book published I found. It's called Everyday Economics, And it was literally as my grandfather's textbook, probably senior of high school. And it talked about 1931 publication date, and it talked about tariffs, and it talked about the revenue generating tariff. And in very simple terms, it explained what we all know, which is that if tariffs are so high that there is no trade, there is no period.
Uh, I have a couple of questions. Um, I'm trying to remember the exact name. I always get confused with that index. The World Economic Freedom Index, published by Bob Lawson and his team from the Cox School. US is not top, but looking at what's going on and looking at what happened to Hong Kong, which has been on #1 spot for many, many years, and then with the passing of the national security law, it dipped one place and then jump right back. So my question is for the U.S. Now that you have mentioned that everyone is going to copy the same, so everyone is basically moving down. So what's your, I guess, prediction on the U.S. on that ranking? Would be Hong Kong, flip a little bit, and then just everyone just stay as it is? So that's my first question. The second question is very interesting and it's very easy for you to answer. Do you have any investment interest in the Beeman Hotel?
Fantastic questions. I actually don't know what the indexes are. They're used to measure the freedom index, so it's a little hard to speculate. I can only talk about trade, and you know, last I looked, Congress still has the authority to pass laws. And one of the cases I make is that I mean, we can all be angry and upset, or if you're not, if you think this is, you know, this is the right track, and it may be difficult, but it's the right track, you know, we can all, you know, have that discussion. But the reality is that on trade, Congress has the constitutional authority to delegate, to change tariffs. Over the years, and this is the part I skipped out of my history, basically, Congress has shown is pretty bad to myself came to passing tariff laws, and you get these very high tariffs in the 1920s and 30s. So there is an opportunity. So what happened after that was that Roosevelt actually convinced, and Cordell Hull, who worked for Roosevelt, convinced Congress to the executive branch to delegate some that authority to be able to negotiate agreements. And Congress held certain rights, but it gave the executive branch some rights as well to be able to change tariffs in certain circumstances. So what's going on now, when everything's an emergency in every sector, security, you know, sector, they're using these loopholes that were used to as a necessary out to be able to do certain things from an executive White House Oval Office authority. Congress can take those keys away. And so I don't think in terms of trade policy, while people may be feeling the impacts, I don't think there is a bridge to be able to continue to pull that authority away on trade. So I don't see that necessarily as that's a political problem. It's not a problem of commitment to freedom, I guess, on that level. Beeman, no, actually, so yes, my family goes back many generations in Dallas, and so I was very surprised to see that there was a hotel named the Beeman Hotel, which actually appropriated my family name. Yes, my family has been appropriated basically across Central Expressway. So no financial interest.
Yes.
My question about China. China is big and it's modern and it's got a huge production capacity. And can you envision the time when we've been in competition with China all over the world, and now we've seen to have turned on everybody all over the world. And would you envision a time when China would begin to be more attractive to a lot of those countries that were not necessarily as attracted to China before, and reach a point where trade with the United States for China would not be as relevant to them as it is now?
Right. Absolutely. I do believe that the Biden administration talked about de-risking from China, not decoupling. I think the Trump administration is, for the most part, for most, particularly major industries, is pretty committed to decoupling on trade for now. I think that is where what the focus is, and why they're being treated differently than others that are kind of gotten a reprieve, can negotiate in the rest. I think that other countries, I describe, as much as what's going on, it's a real challenge for countries like Japan or Korea or the EU or Canada or the rest. I do think that, and I've said this before, that the squeeze that the U.S. is going to be putting on countries to pick a lane, China or the U.S., is probably going to be the harder for them than dealing with the U.S. on tariffs. Because I think that is going to your question, your point, because I think these countries, for the most part, some are very aligned with China, and it's a very transactional kind of understanding of why that is. Some is more philosophically aligned. But there are a lot of countries in Southeast Asia and Asia and other parts that are skittish of being dependent on China, and they don't really necessarily like their situation, but they may not have much of a choice if the U.S. is going to kind of turn its back. So I don't think they're going to embrace China in that latter category, but I think they will only find themselves to be just as dependent, or maybe more dependent. Is all over. Is to my point. If U.S. policy is about isolating China and decoupling from China, it's a terrible strategy.
Yes.
But I would say I'm not against being hard on China. China is a huge problem.
You've referenced in your remarks this morning several references to the 1930s and the Depression. There have been multiple economic forecasters in the last few years who say that it's going to be again, possibly as early as 2030. So, with your experience and in making trade policies and executing on them, where do you see the bright spots for the U.S. as the world to start working in a direction that's helpful?
Well, I think the challenge for the rest of the world is to try and hold on to what they think is important, and the degree to which those countries value the system the U.S. created and now is walking out on. I think they see it in their interest to continue to try and maintain that system. So the question then is, what happens with the U.S.? My personal view is that maybe, I think going back and snapping your fingers, pretending we're all 10 years ago, it's not realistic. As I say, too many things have been broken now. The big problem with what I'm about to say is that, as I also explained, we lack the ability to agree domestically on what we want because we're fighting with ourselves and the other thing to be able to have that vision for what it would be. But in my personal scenario and how this kind of comes back and you kind of fix it is, if we can figure that out in some way, shape, or form, then I think we're looking at creating a new WTO, a different organization. To me, that would be the way of healing this. And the U.S. is at the table with other countries like-minded and have similar values and rules and principles. And they come up with a new agreement that they trade preferentially among themselves based on those rules. And then the country that want to be WTO can disengage from it, or they can stay in it. They can continue to offer those rates to all the other countries in the world, or they can disengage from it and charge what they want to countries that are not members of the system. To me, I think that's a very visionary but very difficult to kind of come back. But I think so much about the current system will be understood to have been of value and importance, but I think going back to it will be really difficult. So I think thinking as a new approach is important. I will continue as I tell my friends and family, I will continue to blab about these things, yes.
Yes. Oh, yeah, bring microphone to her.
I was struck by the language that you were using today when you were talking about country being divided and discrimination and the us and them. And my background is, I have a degree from UCLA in American literature and culture, where we were reading about and learning about the culture of the United States. And, when was the last time our country was so divided? It was the Civil War. Then 100 years later, we're in the Depression. Can we take any lessons away from during that century of what we did wrong and how can we prevent the mistakes that we made along the way? I think are very closely tied to the last time our country was completely divided.
I think in what I try and do, and the best way to do that is continue to just make sure that where we came from, how we got here is dropped in as much as possible, because it just, all these paper articles, everything you see on TV about what's going on now, no one talks about anything I just talked about, basically, right? That there was a logic to it, and logic had to do with a vision of people who were committed to something, of the US, as a state, and finding the win-win, and all the above. So to me, it makes me the saddest, I guess, really, to see all these debates taking place without any context whatsoever, and just kind of assuming that this is normal, instead of questioning, asking the same questions that generations past asked, and came up with answers that led to a different approach. That would be and as a historian, I'm sure you can appreciate that.
Johan.
Well, thank you for speaking to us. Very interesting topic in terms of walking out. So if we could imagine two simplistic scenarios whereby only US walks out and the rest of the crowd sticks together, and they will start cutting deals and formulating another trade organization minus the US. But that would have a huge impact on US's ability to use its reserve currency to fund its government deficit and so on. So that would be huge long-term implication on its financing capacity. That's one scenario. The other scenario will be everyone walks out, but there has to be somewhere that they have to meet up. Maybe in a bar, they start cutting deals among themselves, and that would be another a new, but that very chaotic process to Brownian motion in physics. So people will have to spend a lot of time and suddenly a lot of costs and chaos among the world economies. Where do you see we end up?
Well, as you mentioned, if everyone walks out and everyone ends up at the bar, I see the bar in Star Wars. I think this is what that bar scene looks like, basically. Everyone is just going to look very unusual one another, and a little, everyone's on edge all the time. I think the answer to your question is in the picture of the title of the book. I think other countries are going to try and stick together, and the US is going to have to figure out how, in a saving way, it can come up with a vision that kind of reestablishes its role in that system, basically. I think that's where we are.
You've been focused on goods, and clearly tariffs and rules are only, tariffs can only be applied to goods, and it's much easier to have rules about goods. But talking about the TPP, we're talking about the other rules of the WTO. And for example, the whole concept of focusing on manufacturing as opposed to the rest of the economy in the US, the booming services economy. But there are implications for what you're saying for this world as well. I wondered if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I do spend time on services in my book. I talk about the trade and services negotiations and why the U.S. walked out on that. And digital trade is another example. A lot of those issues, in terms of the domestic politics is more of this kind of fight of the status quo. So you get this flip-flopping. The U.S. tables a digital rule proposal in the Trump administration and then pulls it back in the Biden administration. And then we'll probably see it put back on the table. But I don't think the U.S. is probably going to even, much attend that table anymore. I think that table is pretty much, now in the corner in terms of U.S. interest. Right. I mean, so much of goods trade is generated and run by professionals who do services, as we all know. And every manufacturer, same time manufacturer, they have, so there's the interwoven nature, I think, is really something which you're pointing out, which I think a lot of people do not understand or appreciate. So the degree to which trade is falling off, I think the Trump administration in particular wasn't terribly interested in services except for digital on a certain level, because I think they understood that that was a U.S. superpower in terms of growth, the growth part of the economy. The Biden administration principally just saw services as a bunch of large corporations making money off, and you can go on and on about that. So services have been pretty neglected in the U.S. for the last 8 years, even though it is the largest part of the U.S. economy. So it's just unbelievable but the reason that is being driven by the politics I explained, which are the same electoral politics that focused on a handful of states in 2016, 2020, 2024, and that will again be the focus in 2028, basically. So that's why there's so much, political attention on these issues. Right, the more that the U.S. walks out on the most favored nation rule, on national treatment principles, and is focused on discrimination, U.S. can probably do well on itself with services, but I think it will be the next sector to face major adjustments, and already it is at the ports. Ports are a service, and while certain U.S. trade unions are very supportive of tariffs and they love the tariffs, this was the whole election debate and focus. I just saw today or yesterday that the dock workers are just basically, came out with this really strong statement like, this is outrageous. Can Congress please do this? Because we're losing our jobs, basically, at the ports. So these tensions are just beginning to bubble up.
Yes, you had the hand. So,
I wonder if you could talk about the bond markets. Some of us think that this is sort of a point of no return for any president, even this one, that when that gets upset too much, the idea of not buying foreign debt is this huge stud of a wall that any president would hit at. I wonder if historically and the present what that looks like, you think?
Right. I'm not sure. I have, one thing I have not looked at about the Great Depression was, or the 20s, or even before the 20s, was the impact on national and corporate debt of the tariff policy, which would be kind of an interesting thing to look at, given your question, because it's just such a different kind of shock. This is a supply shock in many ways, and it would cause demand shock on the flip side. Yeah, I mean, I think we were almost like 3 or 4 weeks ago. The satisfying thing to me is I typically try and just focus on the trade policy piece, but as a question talked about, the dollar, the rest, I was briefing I won't mention the institution, but a number of senior economists in Washington several months ago now, and about what I thought was going to come and the rest. And I could tell, because there's so many of these goals and objectives are so contradictory with one another in terms of what the president is trying to seek on economic policy, be the dollar, be it, cheap money, want cheap dollar, and you want, to cut off trade. And I could tell, like, in their own heads, these are like the most preeminent economists maybe in the United States in many ways. It was like a pinball machine in their head, because as soon as it hits off this bumper, hits off that bumper, and they can't really figure out exactly all the implications are going to be. So that, I think, is what you saw about 3 or 4 weeks ago, where everyone's just worried. No one really knows what's going to happen, but just worried that something terrible is going to happen. So I think that, yeah, the bond market's a place to watch. Obviously, the value of the dollar is already one I saw a couple of weeks, about a week ago, one GOP donor, prominent GOP donor, talked about how the U.S. in just a short 90 days was 20% poorer than it was 90 days ago, depending on his measure. If you look at all the values of many different things, basically, yeah, this is where we are. I really, it's hard to say, but yeah, the bond market is just one of many flashing signals that need to be watched.
About the Chevron decision, and I think the polarization picked up in 2014 when money is dumped in great quantities, pushing people's agendas, that makes it very difficult to ever bring the two sides together when you have influencing, pushing people to their agendas and never wanting to come together. Is that a point that you have seen maybe in a greater division, or is that something that's going to be very hard to overcome? And Congress taking back, they're making laws, and they're being threatened by primaries and not being able to do what they're supposed to do because the money funnel is
Right.
in.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, money is influential, and people are paid in Washington to advocate, and that's why I'm not doing that. I don't have any clients, by the way. I intentionally don't, because I just want to tell a story. So I'm not speaking or for or against or with. I just want to explain it so people can process it for themselves and come to their own decisions. And I think that, yes, I mean, so we get in the Washington of influence and people paid to advocate and to achieve a goal. And yes, so that does really influence a lot of things. I think the real question is the degree to which, you mentioned elections, and I think there is a growing concern among Republicans, certainly silent, and a few have spoken out, and they're pretty worried that the next election they're going to get wiped out. And so I think you'll begin to see, as this year goes on, depending on how this policy rolls out, more and more potentially concerned about that if it continues to be a really rough road ahead, basically. So maybe we can all agree, this time 2 years from now, the elections work. And something really fundamentally did change because people felt, but you kind of said, do we have to reach that pain point to get to that? Maybe, I hope not.
With what you shared here on trade policy and the U.S. also walking away from USA and SAWR, I was wondering if you could just share more on your views of China, its point of view on its role, and what actions you expect from China going forward in this environment. Yeah,
from China, we'll see. I think everyone has learned a lot from the first Trump administration. I think the game may be played, but everyone is, part of the game. And I think it's important for people to understand this, is that uncertainty is actually part of the point. Is part of the point in terms of, I think, the president's style of trying to start everything up and see what happens, right? I think we all understand that now. It wasn't quite as obvious 4 years ago, but I think it's very obvious to everyone now. But also trying to think about how to engage, but not lose your leverage, basically, in China and the EU, countries that have this kind of leverage, and just a handful. So I think, it seems like China's ready to sit and kind of wait this one out as long as it needs to wait out and take the hit. It appears for a moment. The president seems to be talking about the negotiations that China have started. That's familiar actually to me too. I've been in that situation before where the president said we're negotiating and everyone's looking around like, no. So, okay. Maybe in his mind, he started negotiations, so fine. That's what it is. Fine. I'm not going to acknowledge what he thinks or suppose. But I do think China is, understands that they're being treated probably a little differently and a little more harshly and severely. And, you know, they're going to do what, you know, to the question earlier, you want expect to do, which is to go around and try and buddy up to others, basically, and sort of creates coalition to put pressure back on the U.S. I do think that generally from the Trump administration perspective, I expect that tariffs on China will always be higher than tariffs on anyone else. Because I think it is a special treatment situation. And while I don't think that's particularly helpful, I do think that, as I mentioned earlier, being tough on China is important, and I think China understands that. So it's a pretty high risk game, and decoupling and what they're doing right now from China, the American public is ready to support not going to Home Depot and, you know, 20% of the stuff not on the shelf anymore, and another 20% is way much more expensive than it was. And, you know, I think there's a pain in the US that I probably try and wait that out a few months and see if the pushback domestically improves their leverage and their negotiating stance, basically. That's my guess.
Well, this discussion can continue for next few hours. Well, please join me for thanking Dr. Beeman.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. This is the last of the Tower Center this semester. Thank you very much for coming to our events this semester. And we will resume in late August. Thank you.